Hello everybody, welcome to my YouTube channel. I'm Stu Chapman and today we're going to be making some old school hardcore. We're going to be sampling from a BBC documentary on YouTube. We'll also be using some of my hardware synths, some VSTs, and probably get some samples from a random a cappella.
Ecstasy, ecstasy.
Alright, let's get started. We're going to make a tune inspired by the Moog Rush Hour.
Ecstasy, MDMA.
But in order to do that, we're going to need to find some dialogue that sounds like it was by a newsreader on the BBC back in the day. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to run a web browser and then we're going to go to YouTube. Once YouTube loads, we're going to search for BBC Everyman, E is for Ecstasy. If you fast forward to 1:40, you'll hear the first sample that we're going to use.
Loving towards other people. It's actually known as the love drug.
And then if you fast forward to about 2:10, 2:15, you'll hear the second sample we're going to use.
Ecstasy.
So there's several websites that will allow you to extract the audio from a YouTube video. I used one of those and saved it as a WAV. I then imported that into Ableton. I chopped out the two samples that I needed from the video. After that, I needed to do a bit of warping to get them to play in time, and I arranged them so that they sound like this.
It's actually known as the love drug. It's actually known as the love drug. It's actually known as the love drug.
Ecstasy, ecstasy.
As you can probably hear on the vocals, I added a bit of echo just to fill out the sound a little bit and to make it sound a little bit more polished. So the next thing I added to this tune was a sample from the Moog. I decided to use the Hoover that's in the middle of the remix of Rush Hour because they've got a nice, clean, kind of flat note that's easy to sample from.
More than 70 of them inside one man.
So I dragged the Hoover into the sampler in Ableton, and then I played on the keys until I came up with a riff that I was happy with. This is the riff. You'll have to excuse the dodgy recording of the piano skills there. It's a bit difficult to play that riff with one hand while you're holding the phone with the other hand to try and get a video. But this is what that pattern looks like once it's quantized in a MIDI clip. So after doing a little bit of EQ, adding a little bit of reverb to the Hoover, it was then time to add in a nice sub bass. So I used Operator for that in Ableton and just made it play the exact same riff as the Hoover, so it just sits underneath it and gives it a nice bit of weight. Putting the Hoover riff and the vocals and the bass all together, the intro now sounds like this.
It's actually known as the love drug. It's actually known as the love drug. It's actually known as the love drug.
Ecstasy, ecstasy.
It's actually known as the love drug. It's actually known as the love drug. It's actually known as the love drug.
Ecstasy, ecstasy.
It's actually known as the love drug. It's actually known as the love drug. It's actually known as the love drug.
Ecstasy, ecstasy.
It's actually known as the love drug. It's actually known as the love drug. It's actually known as the love drug.
Ecstasy, ecstasy.
The next thing to add to this intro was some breaks. So I picked three. The first one was the liquid break, the second one was the Hackney break, and the third was the break from Vocation Equilibrium. They're all different, not used that often, and complement each other quite nicely when played together. And for those of you who are curious, this is what those three breaks sound like. After doing a bit of processing work on the breaks and a bit of arrangement work, this is what the breaks sound like over the Hoovers and bass.
Ecstasy, ecstasy. Ecstasy, ecstasy.
Okay, so for the breakdown of this tune, we're going to make our own rave stab. To do that, we're going to use a free VST called Virgin Choir. So the way we're going to make this stab is we're going to play a bunch of notes together, which is known as a chord. In this case, we're playing a D minor chord across a couple of octaves. It looks and sounds like this. Ableton makes it really easy to resample something. So when you add in a new audio track, you change extension in to resampling, and then you solo the thing that you want to record in. Then you arm the resample track by clicking on the record button, and then you're ready to resample. So then you put the cursor at the start of the chord that you want to record in, and then you press record at the top on the transport bar. That will then record in your chord as an audio sample. So now that we have the audio sample of the chord, we can now add in a MIDI channel and put a sampler on it, and then import that audio sample into the sampler and start playing it on the keys to make a riff that we like. After importing the sample into the sampler, I added some overdrive, did a bit of EQ, and then I adjusted the start point of the sample so that I could make it sound more of a stab. And then I proceeded to play a riff, which now sounds like this.
Ecstasy, ecstasy.
So the next thing I added to the track was a vocal snippet from CC Peniston's Finally. So with this song being based around two samples, one being The Love Drug and two being Ecstasy, I wanted to find a vocal that was probably an ad-lib that I could cut the start off of and make it sound like she's singing E.
Finally, oh, finally, yeah, yeah.
So I took that little bit of vocal at the end of that clip, and initially I just warped it in time with the beat. So once I had each syllable playing in time, I needed to figure out a way of making it loop across several bars, especially given that there wasn't really anything else I could use out of that vocal. So using the warp functionality of Ableton, I was able to change the ending of the vocal so that it played differently every time. The different ending of each vocal is subtle enough that when they play continuously like that, they seem unique. I then made a cut down version of the stab riff that I'd used previously just to sit underneath the vocal to make it more interesting. When played together, they sound like this. The next piece of the puzzle was the type of sound that I use quite a lot. I guess you'd consider it a donk or a pluck, and this patch for operator was made by a friend of mine who goes by the alias of D-Sub. This is what that sounds like. So with a name like The Love Drug, I had to put in a piano riff. And yes, before anyone asks, that is the Korg M1 piano. Next up, I decided to get some strings out of the Roland U220. The next thing I needed to add was a couple of little vocal one-shots, which meant I had to listen to a lot of acapellas to try and find some bits that I could use. Specifically, I wanted some rap vocals. The first part I found was from an Artifacts tune called Come On With The Get Down, and the second vocal was from a Lil Kim tune called Suck My Dick. So the first loop of the vocals I'm going to play is at the original speed, and then the second loop of the vocals is going to be pitched up how I have them in the track.
Come on, like this.
Come on, like this.
Then I added an effect which is called a riser, which is the sort of thing you'd hear leading into a breakdown usually. After that I made some alternate riffs with the donk and the choir stab. Then I put the track together, finished the arrangement, did the mix down, and this is what the final track sounded like.
It's actually known as a love drug. It's actually known as a love drug. It's actually known as a love drug.
Ecstasy, ecstasy.
It's actually known as a love drug. It's actually known as a love drug. It's actually known as a love drug.
ecstasy, ecstasy,
It's actually known as a love drug. It's actually known as a love drug. It's actually known as a love drug.
ecstasy, ecstasy,
It's actually known as a love drug. It's actually known as a love drug. It's actually known as a love drug.
ecstasy, ecstasy. Ecstasy, ecstasy. Ecstasy, ecstasy. Ecstasy, ecstasy.
It's actually known as a love drug. It's actually known as a love drug. It's actually known as a love drug.
Ecstasy, ecstasy.
It's actually known as a love drug. It's actually known as a love drug. It's actually known as a love drug.
Ecstasy, ecstasy.
Come on, like this. Come on, like this. Come on, like this. Come on, like this.
Ecstasy, ecstasy.
It's actually known as a love drug.
Ecstasy, ecstasy.
It's actually known as a love drug.
Ecstasy, ecstasy.
Come on, like this. Come on, like this. Come on.
It's actually known as a love drug.
Ecstasy, ecstasy. Ecstasy, ecstasy.
Come on. Like this. Come on.
It's actually known as a love drug. It's actually known as a love drug. It's actually known as a love drug.
Ecstasy, ecstasy.
It's actually known as a love drug. It's actually known as a love drug. It's actually known as a love drug.
Ecstasy, ecstasy.
It's actually known as a love drug. It's actually known as a love drug. It's actually known as a love drug.
Ecstasy, ecstasy.
It's actually known as a love drug. It's actually known as a love drug. It's actually known as a love drug.
Ecstasy, ecstasy.
So there you have it, guys, a little bit of insight as to how I made that track, the thought process behind the choice of the samples and how I made the stab, that kind of thing. So if you like this kind of content, then let me know in the comments below and give the video a like and maybe subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching.